Alright guys, hi, how are you? It has been a little while since I've been on here, and although I probably should do more of like a formal sit-down explanation video, instead today I want to tell you a little bit of a story. I'm not exactly someone who is that foreign or that averse to doing hard stuff. Like, I have dieted down to the point where my brain barely functions for more bodybuilding shows than I could remember. I've competed in powerlifting competitions. A few years ago, I got into rock climbing. But even after all that, this is the first time I tried something where, looking back at it now in retrospect, I can probably say this was a bad idea. And it's the first time I did something which, yeah, it genuinely scared the absolute shit out of me. Also guys, before we get into the good stuff, I just want to say a big thank you to MyProtein for sponsoring this video and my channel overall. Today being November 1st, this means that they have just started their Black Friday month, which is their biggest sale of the year. And although I always talk about their supplements, for a good reason, it's their activewear, which I have really been enjoying this year. A couple of my absolute favorites would be their fleece zip-ups and their seamless collection, both of which I actually wore on the mountain during this trip. And as always guys, you can use code Vitruvian to get even more of a discount on top of their Black Friday sale. So back in 2021, I hiked the east side of this little mountain in Alberta called Mount Rundle. It's kind of like this long ridge. It just kind of goes on for miles. And right here, you pretty much just like start at the bottom here, kind of like near this lake, and you literally just go up for what felt in my mind like 4 hours. And surprisingly, it wasn't overall that bad. I mean, like, yes, the weather did suck. I did max out my cardio pretty much. So at this point, I'm fully on my hands and knees because I need to grab on. Fuck! But besides all that, not too bad. Now fast forward to earlier this year, I've been climbing more, I've been hiking more, and I decided I wanted to try something a bit harder. So I decided to sign up for a mountaineering course with the goal of completing a climb of a mountain called Athabasca. So Athabasca is a moderately high peak over in the Rocky Mountains that is almost entirely surrounded by glaciers. That's kind of the reasons why it's a bit more complicated to climb, because it's not that tall of a mountain. It's only about 11,500 feet. The problem is that depending on which route you take, it can be a very complicated, a very technical mountain to climb. This is where you kind of cross over from hiking into like actual textbook definition of mountaineering. This is when you're going to need a lot more equipment in terms of things like ropes, crampons on your feet, an ice axe. So I get there and I meet up with the team, which in this case is just myself, our instructor, and one other guy taking the course. That's it. It's just the three of us. Okay, I just arrived at this is Canmore, so you can see the mountains in the back. That one right there, which you can see, is the one that I did back in 2021. We then spent pretty much the entire day just kind of learning how to traverse a glacier safely. It's kind of a nice thing that we had this one way down, like at the foot of the mountain where we could practice, because the next day, when you're actually up on a glacier at like 8,000 feet, no, you better know what you're doing, especially around something called ice crevasses. Now these things that you can kind of see on screen, these are the cracks in the ice. They kind of look like little Grand Canyons, and they run all along randomly throughout the glacier. And this is probably like the main, like number one dangerous thing we had to watch out for. Some of them are only a few feet deep, which you can like literally just walk in and out of, no problem. And some of them can be deeper, like 200 feet deeper. This is the main reason why we actually practice walking on the glacier tied to a long rope. That way, hypothetically, if one of you falls in, the other two should be able to stop your fall and then pull you out of the crevasse. It's really much clearer than it was earlier, so you can actually see the peak, the summit. And that's where we're gonna be at least attempting to summit tomorrow. So the next day we started our hike early, and I mean very early.
40 extra minutes in the day.
You had to be on the trail ready to go pretty much at 4 in the morning, which means that for the first few hours of the hike, the actual climb, you're pretty much in the dark. And when I say dark, I mean absolutely pitch black. In all directions for like 500 kilometers, there is no other light source except for like the little light headlamp thing on your head, and that's pretty much it. So the first thing that was kind of freaky was the trail we were on. We were walking in single file, and if I were to look left or right, you literally can't see anything. And if you were to fall off on either end, you would just disappear into darkness. And we kind of just kept on doing this for what felt like the next 4 hours. At one point, we actually did meet up with another group. However, they were from a different expedition, a more advanced group. So besides kind of like taking a little break with them, eventually they went on ahead until finally at around like just before 8 a.m., just before the sun was about to come up, we finally hit the glacier. At this point, we had to get all of our gear out, we attached ourselves with ropes, and we started making our way horizontally across the glacier. See, the plan was, now that we've made it up to the glacier, we need to walk horizontally about half a kilometer across before we decide which actual route we will take to the summit. I gotta say, this is when I started to kind of freak out a little bit. See, the problem with these climbs is that you have something called a turnaround time, which you can kind of think of as a deadline. You need to hit the peak. You need to summit by that deadline. Otherwise, you're done. You have to turn around pretty much no matter what. And our instructor informed us that in our case, this deadline was noon. If we had not reached the peak by 12 o'clock, by noon, we're done, we're going home, it doesn't matter where we are. And the reason behind this is because if you take too long, if you don't get there until 2, 3 o'clock in our case, you might not have enough time to actually get back down before the weather starts to turn bad, before the sun goes down, before you run out of sunlight. And if that were to happen, you're in deep shit. And so with that in mind, we did have to kind of keep up a decent pace, a very consistent pace with like very little breaks in between. And I remember that unfortunately, this did kind of start to take a toll on me, a bit more than I was comfortable with. But I do remember just as kind of we were reaching the halfway mark of the glacier, I took this shot. Out of the entire trip, this one shot, this was probably my favorite scene. There's a certain feeling you'll get when you're doing something and seeing something, which I think 99.9% of people will never see in their lives. Being able to get that, it feels pretty good. It makes you feel kind of lucky. Hopefully you guys kind of have something else in your lives similar to give you that feeling. I knew that I probably had just about enough energy to make it to the peak. The problem is I wasn't sure that I would be able to get back down, especially get back down in a reasonable time. I don't know if it's the altitude, I don't know if it's like the environment, the cold weather, whatever it may be. My heart rate was like 160 constantly the entire time, but I wasn't physically like out of breath. It was very strange.
Looks fucking gnarly getting across there. That is some serious crevasses. Oh yeah, big time. And then
maybe it was just fear. I gotta be honest, I'm human, that could have been it. If you're running at home and you can't do it, stop. Go home. Take an Uber. Who gives a shit? If you're in the gym and you can't hit a certain lift, You've got safety bars, you've got a spotter, you can just drop the weight, it's all good, go home. You can't do that here. And I gotta be honest, at this point in time, having a 50-50 like belief in my mind of actually being able to summit in time and come back down, that's not 50-50 I can win a bodybuilding show. No, this is a 50-50 chance that I'm going to fucking die. I couldn't make that risk. Especially, I got a family at home now. There's a lot in my life that I now have to think about more than just me. And because of that, I couldn't do it. I couldn't risk it. And we didn't turn back, fortunately. Our instructor did have kind of like a secondary option. We had a plan B. We decided to go for a different peak, a 9,600 foot secondary peak called Boundary Peak, kind of just like about half a kilometer south of the actual Athabasca peak. Now that being said, this secondary option, this plan B, still wasn't exactly a cakewalk. This is really hard. And so at around 11:45 a.m., which is coincidentally almost the original deadline, the turnaround time that we had to reach the Athabasca peak, we finally summited Boundary Peak. Overall, definitely a little bit of a bittersweet moment, but nonetheless, still pretty cool. But actually a little bit of a plot twist. Remember that group that I mentioned earlier, the more advanced group, which kind of like went on ahead without us to the summit? We actually saw them coming back down, like way off in the distance. We saw them kind of giving up and turning around without ever making it to the summit. And our instructor actually radioed them and asked them, like, what's happened? Why aren't you, why are you guys turning around? And it turns out that they actually couldn't summit either because something called an ice sheath had formed the night before. Now, I don't really understand the technical specifics of like the glacier ice morphology or whatever it is, but essentially whatever that formation is really increases the avalanche risk and makes it pretty much impossible to climb, or at least to do so with a reasonable level of safety. And this is actually a problem because just a few years ago, there were 2 people who died on this very mountain in an avalanche. So with that being said, we couldn't summit, they couldn't summit, hell, nobody could summit that day or probably that entire week until that ice sheath, whatever it is gone. Now, I know what you guys are thinking at this point. Igor, are you telling me that had you just pushed on and pursued like another hour or so, that you could have turned around for other like weather climate related reasons as opposed to technically your own weakness? And yeah, I'd be lying if I said I haven't, had that thought cross my mind once or twice or 17 times. And so the main question I have to ask myself is, when I got back, like my girlfriend, she asked me this. She's like, Igor, I was fucking terrified the entire time you were up on the mountain. She even had me send her like GPS pings every hour while I was on there to make sure that I'm not like dead up there. She pretty much said like, hey, are you done? Did you get it out of your system? Like, please tell me you don't need to do this again. And I told her like on day 1 when I returned, like, you know what, babe, you're right, I'm done. And then a week later, I was thinking like, I'm probably done. And now, to be honest, guys, it's been like about a month. And then looking back at all this footage and making this video, to be honest, I'm kind of like, maybe